Well, I hope everybody's enjoying this book. We're getting on. We're all the way up to chapter 8. And I hope you're still enjoying it as I am enjoying reading it. The Lion's Paw by Rob White. Thanks to AW Inc. for allowing us to read this for you folks that are home, away from school for this health emergency that we've got. And this is a chance to do a little reading. If you'd like to read along with us, you can buy a copy of The Lion's Paw by Rob White at www.thelionspaw.org, www.thelionspaw.org. Chapter 8, and Ralph Ray has drawn this little picture for the beginning, and I don't know, wonder who that is. Darkness was coming before sunset as the sky was slowly being covered by a low overcast. While Penny and Nick set the table in the cabin for supper, Ben went to the companionway and looked up at the solid gray of the sky through which the sunlight was soft and also gray. Coming up the ladder a few steps, Ben tapped with his fingernail on the face of the barometer. The needle showed no tendency. "Blast," Ben said. "What's the matter?" Penny asked. "I don't think we're going far tonight," Ben said. "There isn't going to be a breath of wind, and I'll bet you 5 cents it rains. No cloudburst, just a good steady drizzle." "Well," Penny said, "this is a good place. Nobody could ever find us hidden in here." "No, they couldn't," Ben agreed. "But just the same, I want to get out of here. I don't like this feeling of having land within spitting distance all around. I want a little sea room, and I want to get out of the Atlantic, Penny. By now, Uncle Pete's probably got things really organized to find us on this coast, so I want to get over on the Gulf Coast." "How long do you think it'll be this way?" "There'll be wind tomorrow, plenty of it," Ben said. "We'll get out tomorrow night." As he went topside, he added more cheerfully, "As long as we're safe here, I don't really mind not sitting out in the rain all night." It was almost dark when the long, narrow boat came snooping into the creek where the Lion's Paw lay moored. A lone man in the stern sculled the boat with an oar, and it slid silently toward the black sloop and was alongside it before Ben saw it. Penny and Nick were still down in the galley, and Ben said in a voice loud enough for them to hear him, "Good evening." "Howdy," the man said. Nick started out through the cabin, but Penny grabbed him by the seat of the pants. "I want to see who it is," Nick said in an angry whisper. "Shh," Penny said. "It may be somebody looking for us, you dope." "Oh," Nick said, and then he climbed up on the drain board so he could look out through the half-open skylight. He whispered down to Penny, "It's a man in a little boat. I never saw him before." "What's he doing?" "He's talking to Ben." "What's he look like?" "He's little, and he hasn't shaved, and he has a very sharp face." "Does he look like anybody from the orphanage?" Nick shook his head. Then they listened to Ben and the man talking. "Nice boat you got there," the man said. "Belong to you?" "To my father," Ben said. "Mind if I get aboard?" the man asked. "Well, thanks," Nick said, whispering. "He's climbing up. He's barefooted." "Never seen such a nice boat," the man said. "Mind if I look around?" "Go ahead," Ben said, "but don't go below. We're fumigating below, and the stuff will make you sick." "Cockroaches?" the man asked. "Cockroaches," Ben said. "Terrible to get rid of. Where's your father, bub?" "He'll be back," Ben said. "Gone to town?" "Hunting," Ben said. "For what?" the man said. He had a suspicious, whiny voice. Just hunting, Ben said. That all there is aboard, just you and your daddy? And cockroaches, Ben said. You know, the man said, when I first seen your mast sticking up in them trees, sort of hid away like, I said to myself, Beanie, my name's Bean, you're just about to make yourself the easiest $250 you ever will make. So I sculled up this creek. But this ain't the sloop they're talking about on the radio. I heard about that, Ben said. White sloop named the Heart of Lee, wasn't it? 'Twas. And I was mighty disappointed when I come up onto this creek and find me a black sloop name of Lion's Paw, Ben said. But then I seen you, and you answer some to the description of that boy who run off with the sloop, only you look older than 15. Anyway, I see you, and I think to myself, Beanie, what's the easiest thing to change on a boat? And I say, well, it ain't a bit easy to change the rig of one. A sloop is a sloop, and a yawl is a yawl. Them are things hard to change. And the lines and the length and the beam, you can't hardly change them. Then I thinks to myself, the very plumb easiest thing is the name. And next to that is the color. And then I remember yesterday, I heard about this whole family being wiped out in a house burning and a little boy coming to town to get 2 gallons of black enamel paint. The man stopped talking and Penny licked her dry teeth with the tip of her tongue. Then the man went on. You know, my wife, she says I'm the best-hearted man in the state of Florida. She says whenever I hear about something sad happening to folks, I go right now and help them out. So as soon as I hear about this terrible house burning, I start looking for the bereaved to help them out. But nobody around here has heard anything about it. And nobody around here ever before saw that little boy that bought that paint. So, the man said slowly, here I am, but you say this is your daddy's boat and he'll be back. And I believe you, son. I don't really think you're the boy that run away with that sloop and those 2 little orphans. I don't believe you bought that paint and painted this here boat black. So, I don't get the $250 reward that feller Pete Lanford is offering for information. I just don't get that money. That's too bad, Ben said. Ain't it? I'm sore in need of that money. Well, I'll be getting along, son. Goodbye, Ben said. So long. He's climbing down, Nick whispered. Then the man's voice was dimmer. Son, he said, when your daddy gets back, you might as well tell him he's got to fumigate this boat all over again because the skylight is open. And all that gas just escaped harmless into the air. You ain't killed a single one of them cockroaches, boy. That's the cabin skylight, Ben said. We're not fumigating that. My mistake, the man said, his voice fading as he began to scull his boat. It looked to me like that would be where the galley is. What with the smokestack right beside it? Ben didn't answer, and Nick craned his head so he could see. Suddenly, Nick ducked his head. He's coming back, Nick said. They heard the man's voice again. And tell your daddy he might as well stay here in the creek overnight, son, 'cause there ain't gonna be a breath of wind tonight, and it's gonna rain aplenty. It'd be a miserable night for going anywhere. Thanks, Ben said. I'll tell him. So long, the man said. Penny and Nick were waiting in the main cabin when Ben came slowly down the ladder. He walked in silence over to the table and sat down, his shoulders slumped. And when he lifted his hand to pull at the lobe of his ear, Penny saw that his fingers were trembling a little. It seemed to Penny that she could still hear the man's whiny voice, and she suddenly remembered once she had stuck a splinter deep into her hand, and it had become infected before she had finally gone to the head nurse at the infirmary. The nurse was a little like that man. She had a sharp face, and on her chin and her upper lip there were sparse dark hairs. She wasn't very gentle with the needle, and she had probed around in Penny's hand for a long time, sometimes hitting the splinter and hurting worse than ever. That probing was just like that barefooted man's voice, just picking and picking at things. Ben suddenly spoke. "He knows who we are," he said quietly. "I think so too," Penny said. "He'll be back," Ben said. "Will he get a policeman?" Nick asked. "He'll get somebody, Uncle Pete maybe. He could phone and Uncle Pete could drive down here in a few hours." "We better go then," Nick said. Ben turned and looked out through the open companion hatch. The sun had set and it was dark, the sky completely clouded over. "We can't, Nick," he said in a low voice. "There's no wind. We can't use the engine because they would hear it, and they'd stop us before we got out of the river's mouth. We're just caught in a trap." Penny remembered the way Ben had hauled the boat up into the creek with the rope. "Couldn't we pull it out?" she asked. "Nick and I could go along the bank and pull on a rope." "In the river it's too shallow," Ben said. "We'd go aground, Penny." "Get stuck?" Nick asked. Ben nodded. "This boat is a devil when she goes aground," he said. "There's a deep keel, and it slides into the mud and sticks." "Maybe we could paddle it," Penny said. For a second, Ben smiled at her and then shook his head. "Well, let's get all the food we can carry and start running," Nick said. "We could run a long way and they'd never find us in these thick woods, would they?" "I thought of that," Ben said, "but, well, I don't want to leave the boat, Nick. This boat is more home to me than anywhere, and it's got all Dad's things in it. We'd have to carry them too." "I don't either," Penny said. "If we run away from the boat, we might as well just go back to the orphanage." "We could hide," Nick said. "We could all three get in the dinghy and row over to the other side and hide. Then, when they went off to look for us, we could row back again and sail away." Ben looked over at him. Topside, a soft sheet of rain went across the deck, and Penny could see it falling straight down through the open hatch. "The dinghy," Ben said. "I'd forgotten it." And then he stood up. "We'll tow her out with the dinghy," he said. "Penny, you and I'll row, and Nick will steer. We'll slip her right past that snooping rascal." "Row all the way down the river?" Penny asked. Ben nodded. "If we can stand it, but I don't want to get caught just hiding up this little creek, Penny. I don't want to be sort of like a rat in a hole. If they're going to catch us, at least let's give them a fight. We'll row that dinghy until we can't row it anymore. Maybe we'll make the open sea. Maybe we'll have to give up right at the fish pier. But anyway, we won't be just sitting here waiting for them to come take us." "All right," Penny said. Ben smiled slowly. "Someday we'll be sitting around with nothing to do and we'll say, 'Do you remember that night we rowed?'" Then he laughed. "We'll remember it all right." Ben started for the hatch. "Right now, we've got plenty to do. We've got to get everything white off this boat. Sails, rope, life rings, everything that will show white." The three of them went up the companion ladder into the softly falling, steady rain. The Lion's Paw, her black hull and stripped topside almost invisible in the rain and the darkness, swam slowly out of the creek mouth into the broad darkness of the river. Ahead of it, the little dinghy crawled, the two oars making pools of swirling gray. Penny and Ben sat on the amidships thwart of the dinghy, and each pulled an oar. Back on the Lion's Paw, staring into the rain, Nick steered the sloop. At first, in wide curves and sweeps of the tiller, but as the two boats crept along, he steadied down and kept the bow of the Lion's Paw pointed toward the stern of the dinghy. Penny had trouble at first, but Ben kept teaching her, and after a while she stopped catching crabs, which almost pitched her backwards of the thwart, and settled down, pulling almost as hard as Ben, so that he did not have to stop every few strokes to let her swing the bow his way. For a mile, the current of the river helped them a little, and it was not too hard. But the current gradually stopped as the incoming rush of the tide pushed up the river. Steadily, the weight of the Lion's Paw grew greater against the pull of the oars. The rain was soft and chilling. Penny could see it close beside the dinghy, falling into the river and making a thin fog of mist about an inch high. In a little while, she was soaked to the skin everywhere, and gradually she realized that the rain did not help as she had thought it would. It made the handle of the oar slick and hard to hold, and it made the thwart under her hard to sit on. Within the first mile, Penny got tired. At first, rowing had been fun after she learned how. She liked the feeling in her arms and shoulders. She liked the way it got to be easy after she learned not to fight the oar, not to grip it with all of her strength, not to jerk it through the water. She had learned to watch the gray splotch of Ben's hands on his oar and to move her own hands back and forth the way his did. She learned to give the little extra tug at the end of the stroke, and then to turn her wrist down and bring the feathered oar forward close over the water instead of lifting it high and waving it around. Then the slippery handle began to hurt her hands. The wet denim of her pants and the slippery thwart began to rub her. The steady pulling began to ache in the muscles of her arms and back and legs. "How far have we come?" she asked, whispering. "A mile or so," Ben whispered back. "How do you feel?" "Fine," Penny said. She looked through the rain back at the sloop. She could make out the mast and stays against the darkness and the black cutwater sliding through the mist of falling rain. She thought of Nick. Nick was sitting there on a soft cushion with a huge raincoat on and a sou'wester hat whose brim came down over his back and shoulders. All he had to do was push the gentle tiller an inch this way or an inch that way. He wasn't even getting wet. Then they reached the tide rip. In a curving line from bank to bank of the river, the incoming tide meeting the outward flow of the river made a line of gray-white water. In this conflict of currents, the water was shoved up into the short, vicious, choppy waves, which made, above the gentler sound of the falling rain, a faint roaring noise. The dinghy writhed and plunged, bounced from a wave top, smashed into a narrow trough, and staggered up to the next one. Both Ben and Penny caught crabs as the little slapping waves ran out from under the pulling oars or rose up on the forward stroke and knocked the oar out of the oarlock. "Blast!" Ben said in an angry whisper as the Lion's Paw lost way and began to be pushed back up the river by the tide. "Let's try ramming it." For a minute or so, they sat still. They sat idle while the sloop pulled them out of the miniature storm back into the calm of the river. Penny slumped over the indrawn loom of her oar, the rest feeling wonderful. "Let's get as much speed as we can and see if we can't jam her right through," Ben said. "Ready?" "Yes," Penny said, sliding her oar outboard again. The grayness of his hands began to move once more. They went far forward. They went far toward the stern of the boat, and her hands followed his, and then they pulled, the oars biting down into the water, swirling backward, flashing out, biting again. Penny gritted her teeth and rowed, her breath sizzling out into the rain, her eyes blinded by it. She put all her strength against the oar, again and again and again. The dinghy crashed through the first line of waves, and Ben said, "Pull!" as the tow line came up taut and dripping from the water, and the sloop bore down on the tide rip. They were going to get through the little band of vicious waves, Penny thought, as she leaned over and pulled back, her bare feet jamming against the ribs of the dinghy, her heels in the sloshing water. It wasn't enough. The tow line slacked off and then snapped up out of the water as the lion's paw hit the rip. The dinghy was hauled backward up the river again. Penny could hear Ben panting beside her. Then he sucked in the rainwater around his mouth and spat viciously into the bilges. "We'll try along the shore," Ben said. "Maybe it won't be so bad." With the oar feeling like lead, Penny began to row again. They slowly turned the sloop toward the far shore and rowed along beside the roaring tide rip until at last Ben said, "We'd better try here. I'm afraid to take her any closer." Penny looked over her shoulder at the white band of water and suddenly thought, "It's just like the walls and the gates at the orphanage. We can't ever get through it. We'll just butt against it until we haven't got any strength left, just like all the Egonaps butted against the walls." She felt as though she'd been rowing the boat for hours, for nights which had no days, for a long, long time. What if we don't get through, she wondered. When the day does come, we'll just be here for everybody to see. That sharp-faced little man would see them, and Ben's Uncle Pete. She and Nick would go back behind the walls again. They hit the tide rip again. Penny could feel Ben's shoulders moving in unison with hers as they dipped and swung the oars. She wondered vaguely if the muscles she could feel ached as much as hers did. Then they were through. The dinghy slid down the last wave into quiet water again. Penny sighed with relief, and Ben said, "Pull!" and she began to row again. Behind them in the rain, the mast of the lion's paw waved wildly against the dark sky as it hit the rip. And then she came through also and slid down toward the boat. "We've got to get her back in the channel," Ben said, still rowing. "There's shallow water ahead. You okay?" Penny said yes. She was so out of breath that the air she sucked in seemed to burn her throat. Then the lion's paw went aground. The tow rope stopped the dinghy with a wrenching jerk, and Ben said, "Blast it!" and stopped rowing. "What's the matter?" Penny asked. "She's aground, and there's the fish pier," Ben said, pointing. Penny wearily turned her head and could see through the thick veil of rain the lights of the fishing village at the mouth of the river. The rain made the lights sparkle like wet stars, but they seemed far away to Penny and of no importance. She was almost glad the boat was aground because she could rest. She pulled her oar in and bent over it, her whole weight slumping, the rain running out of her cropped hair, running down her face, over her closed eyelids, into the corners of her open mouth. "Tired?" Ben asked, his voice close and low. "I think so," Penny said. "I am too. Let's let her sit there. In an hour, the tide will float her off anyway, and I don't see any sign of Uncle Pete." Penny sighed with relief. She knew that she couldn't possibly push the oar out and drag it through the water even one more time. Ben turned the boat with his oar and headed it back toward the motionless sloop. "I'll put you aboard and then drop an anchor out into the channel, so when she floats, she won't go aground again." "All right," Penny said, but she didn't even think about what she was saying. Her mind felt numb, and all it could think about was the aching in her body, the burning of her hands. Suddenly, Ben stopped rowing. "Listen," he said, and turned his head toward the fish pier. Penny heard the rain falling and heard the little roaring of the tide rip. She didn't want to hear anything else, but the soft throbbing of a motor pushed its way through the other sounds. "There it is," Ben said, whispering. Penny pulled herself slowly upright and looked toward the far bank. At first, she could see nothing but darkness. But as she turned her head, at last she saw a green light low on the water, moving steadily up the river. Is that Uncle Pete?" Penny asked slowly. Ben's voice was flat. "I think so. I can't think of any reason for a motorboat to be going up the river in this sort of weather and at this time of night. Penny?" "What?" "Can you row any more?" Penny curled her stiff fingers around the handle of the oar and slowly pushed it out toward the water. "Yes," she said. "As soon as they find us gone, they'll be back. We've got to get her moving again, Penny." "Yes," Penny said. Ben suddenly patted her wet shoulder, his hand making a soft, wet splashing sound. "I said we'd remember this night," he said quietly. "But if we can get her afloat again, we've got a chance. If we don't, they'll find us, stuck in the mud." Penny began to row again. She was so tired. Her body hurt so badly. Her hands felt as though she were holding them in flames. There was no room in her mind to think about what Ben was doing. She just rowed when he rowed, stopped when he stopped. Ben dropped a kedge anchor far out astern of the sloop. Going back, he and Penny climbed aboard, where Nick was waiting, and a new torture started for Penny's hands as they began to haul in on the anchor rope. Ben would take the rope in both hands, brace his feet against the gallows frame, and haul in until his body came down almost flat on the deck. Then Penny and Nick, also hauling, would slip the rope around a bit, brace their feet, and hold fast while Ben got a new grip and hauled again. Inch by inch, with the rain pattering steadily down, they simply dragged the Lion's Paw backward, stern first, out of the mud. The thick, new, wet, rough, hard rope was more painful to Penny's hands even than the handles of the oar, and her tears fell down with the rain. Then the sloop floated again. Penny slumped down on the deck and sat there while Ben went on working, getting in the anchor, turning the sloop back into the channel. Then he came over to her. "One more mile, Penny. How about it?" Penny heard him. "I can't do it," she thought. "I can't get down in that little boat and row anymore. I think my hands are bleeding now." She held them palm up close to her face and tried to see if there was blood on them, but it was too dark. "I just can't row anymore," she thought. "I can't bend my fingers so they'll hold onto the handle of an oar." But she stood up slowly and walked back without saying anything and followed Ben as he got down into the dinghy. As Ben slid his oar out toward the water, on which the rain made a crisp frying noise, he said, "I'm about shot. How about you?" "I'm tired," Penny said. Ben dipped his oar. Automatically, Penny began to follow the movements of his gray hands, back and forth, back and forth. In a few minutes, Penny began to cry again. The water running into her mouth got a faintly salty taste from her tears, and the crying made it hard for her to breathe. She clamped her lips shut so Ben wouldn't hear her and went on crying as she leaned forward and pulled back, leaned and pulled. Now the lights of the fishing village were abeam, the string of wet lights going out on the fish pier moving toward them. Slowly, slowly, they were fading back into the dark rain. "Half a mile," Ben said. "All right," Penny said. After a while, Ben said, "I think we've made it, Penny." "What?" Penny said vaguely. Ben put one of his hands down on top of hers. "Let me have it," he said. "You move up." "No," she said, and pushed his hand away. They rode in silence for a long, long time. "You're all right," Ben said finally. It made her feel good. It made the pain feel less. She leaned forward, dipped the oar, swung back, putting all her strength in it. "I think we've got about an hour's start on him," Ben said. 15 miles. He put his hand on hers and stopped the movement of her oar. Through the rain, the sloop glided slowly toward them until the bows were rubbing against the dinghy. Ben climbed aboard it and reached down with both hands. Catching her wrist, he lifted her out of the dinghy. "Go below," he said, "and fix your hands, Penny." "All right," she said. In the dark cabin, she felt her way along. Then, when her fingers touched the soft, dry edge of her bed, she stopped. For a moment, she stood perfectly still. And then, suddenly crying again, she stripped off her wet clothes, dropped them in a pile, and got into the bed. For a long time, she shivered violently, but at last the warmth of the covers began to seep into her. Drowsily, she heard the throbbing of the engine, the surge and glide of the sloop as it entered the open ocean. In the cockpit, Ben and Nick sat huddled against the rain. When a faint breath of wind stirred, Ben raised his head, feeling the wet wind on his cheeks, turning his head slowly from side to side to find the true direction. "Go below and see how Penny is," Ben said. Nick got up and sloshed down into the cabin. He came back in a moment. "She's asleep," he said. "Good. Her hands must be in terrible shape," Ben said. "I've been rowing all spring, and even mine have blisters." "We went so slow," Nick said. "Was it hard?" "Yes," Ben said. The wind breathed again, whirling the straight falling rain around the yellow light of the binnacle. "Nick, old boy," Ben said, "we're on our way. Tomorrow, we'll be in the St. Lucie. Nothing to do but steer the boat, fish, sleep, eat, and lie in the sun. All our troubles are over." "I've been waiting," Nick said. "I didn't know that running away would be such hard work." "Neither did I," Ben said. The wind was blowing steadily now from the northwest. "Let's get sail on this boat and get along," Ben said. And that's the end of chapter 8.